Dzień dobry Państwu, dziękujemy bardzo za przybycie. Naszym gościem jest pani profesor Helen Rosenberg z Uniwersytetu Wisconsin-Parkside. Pani Helen jest socjolożką, ale też kilka słów o sobie powie, ja sobie tego przetłumaczę.
So I want to thank everybody for inviting me here. I've been asked to give a presentation on issues of race in the United States. I am no stranger to controversy. I'm in the Department of Sociology. I want to apologize to my students because this is the second time they are going to be hearing this presentation. I'm just wondering if we can get to some of the videos or not.
The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social
Thank you for your patience. We'll see if we can get through some of the videos that I have presented. If not, I will speak about them as we continue on. So I appreciate your tolerance for my English, and I thank Ola for the introduction. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the issues of race that are going on in the United States at this time. We have a long history of racism, and I can discuss it in terms of historical and social context. And then I would like to open up to questions and discussions. And I have 10 students here from the United States who are in college at the University of Wisconsin-Parkside. And if you have questions for them, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer them as well. So I wanted to talk about the issue of race as something that is socially constructed. Race, as we all know, we look at people's individual features, their physical features, and we categorize them on the basis of how we perceive they are as human beings. And many times we use physical characteristics as a social indicator of what people are like. But what I wanted to do is emphasize the relativity of this categorization system. I have a couple of examples. For example, in Britain, in 1951, it was important for the British government to categorize people by race, and so they did so in India. But then when India got its independence, they no longer used the categorization that Britain gave to the people there, and they divided people up by caste instead of by racial characteristics. Another example is Brazil. That's a very diverse society. And so when the government categorizes people, it asks them how they want to define themselves. And so, according to the census in Brazil, Brazil is composed of 48% white, 43% multicultural, which means that people define themselves in terms of a combination of different categories of races. And so it's very difficult to set people into little categories or blocks in order for us to assign social characteristics to those people. 8% in Brazil are considered black, 1% are considered Asian, 0.5% are considered indigenous. So as you can see, every country classifies people's race differently, and oftentimes the census lags behind how people define themselves. So in the United States, we used to have 5 categories of race. And then over time, as people began to redefine who they were in terms of their history, their family, and their identity, the census then started catching up with what people define themselves as. In addition to that, race becomes a social category that is fluid. It changes over time. And so I wanted to show you a YouTube video of how race has been redefined over time in the United States.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then, the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous one drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then, suddenly, in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent, but the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes,
So, despite the fact that we're not quite done with the video, what the video underscores is the fact that people can change races, people can change identities. And in the history of the United States, race has been used politically to keep some people down and to deny them resources that whites typically have access to. If you take a look at this category as this picture of people, you really don't know what's going on, you don't know about their background, you don't know about their history. And yet, the more information we have about them, the more people tend to create a status structure or a status hierarchy, redefining who they are. So, in the United States, race tends to be a primary means by which different societies differentiate status. And one of the examples I wanted to provide is of Irish immigrants first coming into the United States in the 1980s, in the 1860s, excuse me. And so the first picture is a picture of an Irish person, and you can see the color of his skin is black. And the Irish were considered black Irish. They were assigned a lower status in our society. And these pictures were in magazines that were open to everyone to view. Another stereotype that was supported was of Irish drinking. And it fueled the stereotype that Irish spend their time drinking, and the stereotypes were used to justify discrimination in the United States. As the Irish became more assimilated in the United States culture, this type of stereotype seems very, very strange to people today. And yet, in the mid-1800s and early 1900s, people used these stereotypes to discriminate against the Irish people. I wanted to show another interview with a young woman. This is a woman who was the head of the National Association for Colored People in Spokane, Washington, in the United States. You have one picture of her when she was a teenager in her family. And then you have another picture of her when she redefined her race and became the leader of the NAACP in the United States. I'd like to show the interview with her. I'm not sure whether it's possible, and so We'll wait a little bit. Okay. So this is an interview with a woman, her name is Rachel Dolezals, and she came from a family she had two adopted brothers who were African American, and over time she redefined who she was, and you can see that she changed her physical characteristics, and in addition to that she changed her identity as well. She changed her identity to the point where she became a leader for Black people in the Northwest United States. After that time, it was revealed by her father that she was not Black, she was white.
Rachel Dolezals, good morning, nice to see you.
Good, nice to see you too.
You've had a busy week. All the headlines, top trending item on Twitter. You resigned your post at the NAACP, and you started a discussion on race and what it means in this country. Did this come as a surprise to you, or did you always expect the lid would be blown off your story at some point?
The timing of it was a shock. I mean, wow. The timing was completely unexpected. As to the second question, I did feel that at some point I would need to address the complexity of my identity.
Let me just say, we can't talk about the big picture that you have created without talking about the small picture first. Let me just ask you the question in simple terms again, because you've sent mixed signals over the years. Are you an African American woman?
I identify as Black.
You identify as Black. Let me put a picture up of you in your early 20s, though. And when you see this picture, is this an African American woman, or is that a Caucasian woman?
I'm not in my early 20s, but...
That's a little younger, I guess? Yeah.
I got 16 in that picture.
Is she a Caucasian woman or an African American woman?
I would say that visibly she would be identified as white by people who see her.
But at the time, were you identifying yourself as African American?
In that picture, during that time, no.
Your parents were asked this question this week, and they didn't have any trouble answering it. Here's what they said. She's clearly our birth daughter, and we're clearly Caucasian. That's just a fact. Your father went on to say she's a very talented woman doing work she believes in. Why can't she do that as a Caucasian woman, which is what she is? How do you answer that question?
Well, first of all,
really just using race
I
as a
really
substitute
don't
for
see
other
why they're in
factors.
such a rush
Since
to
where your ancestors came from.
whitewash
Or
some of the work that I have done and who I am and how I've identified.
Dorothy Roberts
And
explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which includes some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This
back to a very early age with my self-identification with the Black experience as a very young child.
When did it start?
I would say 5 years old.
You began identifying yourself as African American?
I was drawing self-portraits with the brown crayon instead of the peach crayon and the black, black curly hair, and that was how I was portraying myself.
So it started way back then, Rachel. When did you start, and I'll use the word, you can correct me if you don't like it, when did you start deceiving people and telling them you were Black when you knew their questions were pointed in a different direction? When someone said to you back then, are you Black or white? And you'd say, I'm Black. You didn't say, I identify as Black. You'd say, I'm Black. When did you start deceiving people?
Well, I do take exception to that because it's a little more complex than me identifying as Black or answering a question of, are you Black or white? I was actually identified when I was doing human rights work in North Idaho as first transracial, and then when some of the opposition to some of the human rights work I was doing came forward and started, the next newspaper article identified me as being a biracial woman, and then the next article, when there were actually burglaries, nooses, etc., was this is happening to a Black woman, and I never corrected.
Well, why didn't you correct it? You knew it wasn't true.
Well, because it's more complex than being true or false in that particular instance.
But the cynics and the skeptics will say you didn't correct those
I didn't
reports
correct those reports.
because it worked for you. Because it helped you meet your goals. Is that fair?
I don't necessarily think that's fair. I think not just at that time, but before then too, I have had to answer those who haven't seen me, and because I'm a black hairstylist, have styled my hair in many different ways, have been identified as mixed, light-skinned, black, etc. And I've had to answer a lot of questions throughout my life.
You've changed your appearance. Your complexion appears darker than it did in the photos of you as a young lady. Have you done something to darken your complexion?
I certainly don't stay out of the sun, and I also don't, as some of the critics have said, put on blackface as a performance.
Yeah, let me address that, because some people have said that the way you've changed your opinion is akin to putting on blackface, and Jonathan Capehart wrote in the Washington Post, blackface remains highly racist no matter how down with the cause a white person is. Do you understand what he means by that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you agree with
I
it?
have a huge issue with blackface. This is not some freak birth of a nation mockery blackface performance. This is on a very real, connected level. How I've actually had to go there with the experience, not just a visible representation, but with the experiences. And then when I got full custody of Isaiah, and he said, "You're my real mom," and he's in high school, and for that to be something that is plausible, I certainly can't be seen as white and be Isaiah's mom.
A couple of quick points. There are reports that at one time in particular, you looked at a friend of yours, a guy named Albert Wilkinson, and you told friends of yours that he was your father. He is an African-American man who is clearly not your father. Was that done to enhance your resume as an African-American woman? Or was there another reason for that?
There's another reason, yeah. He actually approached me in North Idaho, and we just we connected on a very intimate level as family. And
but why point out an African-American man and say that is my father when you know that your father is a Caucasian man?
Albert Wilkerson is my dad, and any man can be a father, not every man can be a dad.
Your lawsuit against Howard University in 2002, where you claim you were discriminated against because you were a pregnant white woman. Do you understand how people could hear that and say, here's another example. She says she identified herself as being African-American or black from a young age, but here's a case where she identified herself as a white woman because it worked for her under the circumstances.
The reasons for my full tuition scholarship being removed and my teaching position as well, my TA position, were that other people needed opportunities, and you probably have white relatives, and that they can afford to help you with your tuition. And I thought that was an injustice.
Would you make the same choices, given all that's happened, and given the fallout from it, but also the positive side of the discussion that has come out of it? Would you make the same choices you've made, Rachel?
I would.
And what do you want to come out of it? What discussion do you want to prompt?
Well, as much as this discussion has somewhat been at my expense recently in a very sort of viciously inhumane way, come out of the woodwork, and the discussion is really about what it is to be human, and I hope that really can drive at the core of definitions of race, ethnicity, culture, self-determination, personal agency, and ultimately empowerment.
But when you say you would make the same choices, wouldn't you go back and perhaps be a little more transparent about certain things in your life, or correct some of the things that were said about you that you knew to be incorrect?
There are probably a couple interviews that I would do a little differently if circumstances, in retrospect, you know, I knew what I know now. But overall, you know, my life has been one of survival, and the decisions that I have made along the way, including my identification, have been to survive and to, you know, carry forward in my journey and life continue on.
You resigned your position at the NAACP out in Spokane. Do you feel you could have been as effective? By the way, you should get a lot of credit. A lot of people feel you breathe new life into that chapter. Could you have been as successful? Could you have had as big an impact had you been a Caucasian woman as opposed to being identified as an African American woman?
I don't know. I guess I haven't had the opportunity to experience that in those shoes. So I'm not sure.
And finally, your two sons, Isaiah and Franklin, are here in the studio.
They are.
If I were to ask them if you're a black woman or a Caucasian woman, how do you think they'd answer?
Well, I actually was talking to one of my sons yesterday, and he said, "Mom, racially, you're human, and culturally, you're black." And, you know, so, I mean, we've had these conversations over the years. I do know that they support the way that I identify, and they support me. Ultimately, we have each other's back. We're the three musketeers.
Rachel Dolezal. Rachel, thanks for talking to us this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And you can weigh in with your thoughts on Rachel's story. Tweet us using the #.
So, in the last two examples, we've got two different situations that I presented. One about the Irish coming into the United States, where a racial category was imposed on them, and that was used to legitimate discrimination against a particular group of people. In the case of Rachel Dolezal's, she redefined who she was as part of her identity. And so we can talk about this later, but I want you to think about who is targeted for discrimination. And I'm thinking not only within the United States, but across many cultures as well. So I wanted to talk about the implications of our interactions with other people. In 1923, a philosopher by the name of W.I. Thomas developed this theorem. And he said, if men define situations as real, they are real in their consequences. So what does that mean? That means that if I perceive you to be a certain type of person and I interact with you in that particular way, then how I interact with you redefines who you are. And so even though you may consider yourself to be one way, if I interact with you in perhaps a negative or sometimes even obsequious or positive way, that redefines who you are. And so when we talk about our interactions with other people, our interactions are often based on different categories of people. One category is race or power, gender, race, religion, and ethnicity. And so whether right or wrong, our actions are driven by how we interpret different situations. And the consequences of our interpretation are real no matter how we define ourselves outside of those situations. So I wanted to talk about what it means to be a minority in the United States, and I'm thinking outside of the United States as well. So a minority of people are distinguished by their physical characteristics, also possibly their cultural characteristics, and they are set apart from what's considered a population in power. And so when we think about a minority, we think about people who are discriminated against in some particular way. And I think about gender as one minority, and I've had people say to me, well, but women, there are more women in this world than there are men. But that doesn't matter. Numerically, we may be in the majority as women, but women are still singled out for discrimination. In South Africa, blacks are a majority, numerically, but they're still singled out for discrimination and therefore considered a minority. So we can move from our own attitudes, our own perceptions, to how we behave toward people. And when we think about what it means to be prejudiced, the word prejudice comes from a root prejudge. And prejudice means that we make judgments about people through generalizations. So one characteristic of prejudice is to know one person and then to generalize to an entire category of people. Another example of prejudice is that we hear about different types of people and then make generalizations about them without ever interacting with them. I'm going to tell you a story, my own personal experience. So I am a naturalized citizen of the United States, and when my family moved to the United States, we were moved into an all-black neighborhood. And we lived there, I want to say, for about 5 or 6 years, and then moved into a white neighborhood. And when I moved into that white neighborhood, I heard my fellow students, I was young at the time, talk about blacks. And I was hearing what they said, and it was said out of ignorance. They would make comments about hair, they would make comments about facial characteristics, and I couldn't understand what they were talking about because they had never experienced any interaction with blacks. And yet their prejudices came from a history of stories that their parents may have told them, that their friends may have told them, something I couldn't understand from my own experiences as well. So when we think about prejudgments, we think about generalizations where we generalize to a whole category of people from an experience with one person, or through diffusion of false information when people just pass on this information from over time. The other thing is oftentimes we focus in on one type of news media that perhaps is in accordance with our own political views without really taking into account alternative media sources. And so we tend to view the world in one particular way without opening up our minds or perhaps even examining the closed minds of others and how they think as well. So that's the sort of core of some of our attitudinal prejudices. When we talk about discrimination, we talk about behavior. And this is when we move into unfair treatment of a particular category of people, where we start acting upon the stereotypes that we have about others. And I'll see this in stores where a clerk will be paying attention to me, and then a person of color walks into the store, and the clerk will excuse him or herself from me and follow someone else in the store. And so that action is a message to me, and more so it's a hurtful message to the person that he or she is following. The most extreme form of discrimination is apartheid. In the United States, we have segregation. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and it is done intentionally by not allowing people to live in certain neighborhoods. Landlords will refuse to rent homes. Banks will refuse to give mortgages to people of color. And so people will move into neighborhoods because those are the only neighborhoods they are allowed to move into, whether they want to be there or not. So I want to talk a little bit about racism, which is a specific type of discrimination. And in the United States, we tend to think in terms of two races. We tend to be very black-white in terms of our distinctions. And so we're talking about unfair treatment, and the group that is targeted the most are African Americans in our country. And it's so widespread and it's so permeated in our society because we have a history of laws that made it possible for us to discriminate against blacks. And so we have a history of segregation, and prior to that we have a history of slavery. And we have systematically excluded blacks and other people of color because they cannot get what whites get. And as you can see in the second bullet, the quote is, "You get more because others exist to get less." So in other words, if you are white, you are entitled to privileges that other people don't have. And one of the sad things for me with my students is that many of them don't understand the privileges that they have been born with. They don't see that other people of color do not have the same privileges as they. So I wanted to mention a little bit about institutional racism in our country. Racism has been used to allow whites to create a class of people, originally slaves in our country. It was economically functional for the United States to do this, and we developed a system of institutional racism. The video talked about the one drop of blood, who is defined as who, and then what privileges people have access to on the basis of their race. In 1896, there was a Supreme Court hearing, Plessy versus Ferguson, and that established separate but equal. And our first African-American Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, said that philosophically and logically, by separating people, they necessarily cannot be equal. And the picture depicted here is a situation in the South where you have separate, but you can see that it is not necessarily equal. And yet this has been built into our legal system, and it was accepted for many, many years. And it wasn't until 1954 that this was challenged by Thurgood Marshall in a Supreme Court case called Brown versus the Board of Education, where students, black students, could not have access to the same education as white students. And after 1954, just because the Supreme Court said it was wrong, there were riots, there were beatings. Police in the South actually used hoses on black children who tried to break the color barrier in different schools in the South. It was a difficult, difficult struggle for blacks. So there are different situations that people get around with now where you can discriminate, and it's still considered legal, it's still painful. And people will use phrases like, if I'm applying for a job in a company, well, you don't have the right fit in our company. You don't have the right image. Or banks will charge people of color more for taking out a mortgage because they feel that they get nervous about it as well. And I'm going to give you an example. My husband used to work in a law firm, a very big law firm in Chicago. And there was a woman who was Muslim, and she had her head covered, and she applied for a job as a receptionist in the company. And they hired her, but the position of receptionist was no longer available to her. They didn't want her up front greeting people as they walked into the law firm. And so they gave her a position somewhere in the back of the law firm where people couldn't see her. She sued the law firm. Now we're talking about a law firm. You'd think that they would know the law. It didn't matter. Their prejudices overrode their understanding of the law. And she won the lawsuit, but she refused to go back on the job. She was very angry, and they settled with her. monetarily. So racism permeates everywhere in the United States, and we have a very long history of supporting it as well. So, oh, for goodness sakes, I forgot about that. Okay. So I wanted to give you some statistics about some things that happen in terms of blacks in our country. Black drivers are 23% more likely to be pulled over by police than white drivers. Black drivers are more likely to be searched by police than white drivers looking for drugs. Black drivers are more likely to be ticketed and arrested. Blacks are 3 to 4 times more likely to be killed by police than whites. And blacks are 4 times as likely to be choked, pepper sprayed, or tasered than whites. And I'm going to give you an example. There's a professor at our university whose son became 16 years old and was allowed to drive. Well, if you're white, parents feel freedom. Okay, my son is going to be driving. I no longer have to be carpooling. I have a little bit more freedom. For a person of color, it's very different because they have to warn their children. Be careful on the streets. Watch your speed limit. And I sometimes am on the road and I wonder why black drivers are driving so slowly. And now I understand. Because they are targeted by law enforcement to a much greater extent than our whites who are driving. So I want to talk a little bit about microaggressions, and I know we have all experienced them. They're the little things that people will say to us that are additive over time and create a big hurt. So a microaggression is something small, but they're cumulative. They add up over time, and they're perpetuated by many different people, and sometimes we don't even know what we're saying to people, and yet they're painful and hurtful. And so there are some examples here in this slide. You know, when I'm driving in a black neighborhood and my friends tell me to lock the doors, and a black person walking down the street sees me press that button, and the message is there. I don't trust you on the basis of your color. A clerk following someone of color in the store. Why are you following me and not this other person in the store? Or additional security checks. Or when I see police pulling people of color over who are driving in the street, and then checking their trunks when they ordinarily wouldn't check the trunk of a white person. On the other side of the slide, there are some examples of racism on an interpersonal level. Why do black people give their kids funny names? Blacks find fat women attractive. So all of those little things in a statement can be very, very painful. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Oh my goodness, I was going to give you stories, but I'm going to stop. So here's an example of a microaggression. This woman identifies herself as an American, and people will come up to her and say, well, no, where are you really from? Well, I'm an American. And yet they're assigning her color and her appearance, and they don't believe that she is part of an American culture. And I'm sure this happens across all nationalities. So the question is it about race? Yes, if a person of color believes it's about race. Yes, if it disproportionately affects people of color. Yes, if it's part of a broader pattern of events that disproportionately affects people of color. So my call to you, or my plea to you, is to talk about this. We must be talking about race. What advantages do I have as a white person, or someone who's defined as white, that give me over people of color? think about your gender, think about your religion. And many of us have aspects of our lives that we consider to be subordinate. We are not all one person. And so we need to talk about and realize who we are and where we come from, but also to understand, and this is difficult, how these physical characteristics and the qualities that we assign to other people impact their lives as well. So I always question myself, who is the person that I want to be? How can I learn more about my own racism? It's difficult, and when someone says, I'm not racist, I don't believe it. Because living in a society that has a history, legally, socially, culturally, of race, we cannot be free of racism. So how do I understand my own values, and how do I check my privilege? Can I recognize institutional racism? And the most difficult part is, can I speak out in support of other people who I see are discriminated against? Can I boycott businesses? Do I boycott businesses that I know discriminate against workers of color? Can I give to organizations that fight racism? Finally, I do want to open this up to questions, and I know I'm out of time. So thank you very much. Sorry for the technical difficulties. But if we have some time, I'd like to open this up for questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Helen, very much for a very inspiring paper. Very challenging lecture as well, because it makes us think, where are we, in which position we are personally. Thank you very much. If you have any questions in Polish, I may translate them in English, then Helen could answer directly. We can pass the microphone as well.
Professor, thank you very much for your interesting speech. And I have two questions, maybe more doubts. Maybe I didn't understand clearly what you wanted to say out. The first question is, you didn't mention about anything more than black people in your lecture. I understand the limit of the time, but my question is what America is doing right now about the racism against people with the Latin American origin. We know that it's a big discussion about that right now in America. So could you comment it or say us more the current situation? And the second, race is not something what we are able to choose. It is something what is given us when we are born. So what was the reason? What was your aim to show us this very strange woman who wanted to pretend somebody else which she isn't definitely? So what was your aim? Why you showed us this video? Because later in your speech was no comment to that. So thank you very much.
So I'm going to address the second question first, and my point is that race is a very fluid statement, and I know that we are born into a particular family, but our perceptions of what people are on the basis of how they look are just our perceptions. how people define themselves is very different. So, depending upon what part of the country you're in, you can have the features change, and I have met people who identify as black, who look who are even lighter than I am, and yet they have a history of African American culture in their lives. So my point is that we are not defined by set categories, that there is a fluidity in people's skin color, in people's physical characteristics, and we cannot, on the basis of our own judgment, assign a race to a particular person. We have to understand where that person is coming from in order for us to understand their characteristics. So there's a difference between how I define myself and how other people define me or interact with me. So that's one thing. With regard to Latin American, is that what you were referring to, or Hispanic people in our country? In terms of, in my presentation, I really talked about extremes. In terms of access to resources, blacks in our country are denied the most resources of any racial category. If you're Latin, it's a little bit easier for you living in our country. And so I focus in on extremes. That's the only reason.
The other question is what the America is currently do. I'm sorry, the question was not, well, you didn't mention about other people, other groups apart from blacks, but the question was what in America you are doing to protect those people from other groups. What is the currently passed the law which protects those people from other races who are also somehow touched by this inequality? So that was the question.
So there is an issue. The laws are supposed to apply equally to everyone, and they do not. And so I don't think I know enough to answer your question. I'm going to say that people who are of different races of color other than blacks have different problems. And it's an issue of the extent of their status within the particular area that we're in. So I'm going to go into the regionalization of the United States. And if you are a Latino in the south of the United States, you have a much more difficult time in terms of your freedom and your access to resources than if you were in the northern United States. The same thing with being African American. I think about Cubans in Florida. That's a whole different, they have higher status and they're more integrated, and yet they tend to discriminate more in terms on the basis of class. So it's pretty complicated, and it's also very regionalized.
Serdecznie Państwu dziękujemy. Z uwagi na czas będziemy musieli już kończyć. Ja chciałam jeszcze raz serdecznie podziękować pani profesor Helen Rosenberg za trudną, bardzo szczerą mimo wszystko prezentację na temat sytuacji rasowej w Stanach Zjednoczonych. Myślę, że nie każdy jest w stanie tak szczerze mówić o tym, co się dzieje w jego najbliższym otoczeniu. So again, Helen, thank you for being very honest with us, because it is a kind of courage to tell what's really happening in my home. So we are not very familiar with those situations, and even the idea of this fluid notion to your race or to your identity. This is a very interesting issue. Thank you very much for listening to us, and again, thank you, Helen.
Dziękujemy Państwu bardzo.